800 Jewish orphans walked past Nazi checkpoints every single morning in broad daylight. For 3 years straight. They weren't smuggled through tunnels. They weren't hidden in attics or cellars. They didn't move under cover of darkness. They walked the main road through Valmer-aux-Bois at dawn, paired off in oversized coats, carrying lunch pails and schoolbooks, while German soldiers stood watch less than 20 feet away. And the soldiers never stopped them. Not once. This happened in a village that wasn't remote, wasn't isolated, and wasn't unknown to the Nazi occupation. Valmer-aux-Bois sat directly on a Wehrmacht supply route. Swastika banners hung from the town hall. Checkpoints operated at both ends of the village. Every citizen was registered. Every movement was monitored. So how do you hide 800 children without hiding them at all? The answer lies in Valmer-aux-Bois, and the man in the wide-brimmed hat who understood something the Third Reich never could. That the most dangerous place to commit resistance is sometimes the safest place to survive it. It was November 1942. The Nazi occupation of France had hardened into routine brutality. Jewish families were being torn from their homes across the country. Children separated from parents at the gates of Drancy, the transit camp outside Paris where entire families awaited cattle cars heading east. The roundups were methodical. The deportations were efficient. And in the chaos, thousands of children simply vanished into the machinery of extermination. But not all of them. Valmer-aux-Bois was a village of barely 3,000 souls, perched in the rolling farmland of northern France, where the soil was poor and the winters were unforgiving. It was unremarkable in every way. Stone cottages with slate roofs, narrow streets that turned to mud in the rain, a church steeple that had stood for 400 years. The kind of place occupying armies passed through without a second glance. Except for one detail that mattered more than anyone realized. Valmer had memory. The villagers were descendants of Catholics who had lived through the wars of religion, who had watched neighbors denounced, who had buried family members killed for sheltering the wrong person during the wrong regime. Their grandparents had stories of midnight knocks, of children hidden under floorboards, of silences that saved lives. Persecution wasn't history to them. It was inheritance. So when the first Jewish child arrived in the village in the autumn of 1942, a girl of 9 with a paper tag pinned to her coat and eyes that had already seen too much, the farmer's wife who opened the door didn't hesitate. She took her in. 2 days later, 3 more children arrived, then 7, then 12, and then, like water finding cracks in stone, they kept coming. Children whose parents had been arrested, children who had leapt from deportation trains, children whose names had been erased and rewritten on forged baptism certificates by priests who believed paperwork could be a weapon. And the village made a decision, not in a town hall meeting, not with speeches or votes, but in the quiet way that moral clarity sometimes spreads, through kitchen conversations and Sunday mass whispers, and farmers passing word in the fields. They would not hide the children. They would do something far more dangerous. They would make the children invisible by making them ordinary. It all began with Abbé Lucien Vaubert, the village priest, tall and lean, with wire-rimmed glasses and a face that rarely showed emotion. Vaubert wasn't a man built for theatrics. He spoke quietly. He moved carefully. And he understood something the Nazis, with all their surveillance and terror, could not grasp. That power depends on disruption. That tyranny feeds on panic, secrecy, and reaction. So Vaubert proposed the opposite, routine. Every morning, at dawn, the children would walk, not hidden, not rushed. They would move through the village in pairs, dressed like local schoolchildren, carrying books and lunch pails, following the same routes at the same time every single day. They would attend classes in a schoolhouse where teachers taught nothing. They would walk past checkpoints where soldiers saw them so often they stopped asking questions. The plan was insane, and it worked. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of wartime rescue. It wasn't led by an elite few. It was a mass conspiracy. The registrar, Sibylle Cournot, kept ledgers filled with the names of dead children, names she reassigned to the living, matching birth dates and census records so perfectly that German inspectors found nothing wrong. Farmers employed children on paper for jobs that didn't exist. Teachers enrolled students in classrooms that never held lessons. Shopkeepers watched the patrols and timed the children's routes down to the minute. Everyone knew, everyone participated, and everyone kept the secret. When the first German officer asked Vaubert why so many children walked the roads each morning, the priest didn't flinch. "War orphans," he said simply. "French children displaced by the bombing. We're caring for them until their families can be located." The officer nodded, filed a report, and moved on. Because here's the thing the Nazis never understood. People stop seeing what they see every day. Familiarity doesn't breed suspicion. It breeds invisibility. The soldiers saw the children so often that the children stopped being a question and became part of the landscape. Just another feature of occupation routine, like the daily truck convoys or the weekly inspections. And so, for 3 years, 800 Jewish orphans walked the roads of Valmer-aux-Bois in broad daylight, past soldiers who could have arrested them with a word, past checkpoints that could have demanded their papers, past collaborators who could have reported them for a bounty, and no one did. You're probably asking yourself, how did they pull it off? How did a village of farmers and shopkeepers conspire against the Third Reich without being destroyed? The answer will surprise you, because it involves something the Nazis never expected, something their entire ideology made them blind to: the refusal to act afraid. Before we continue, let me introduce you to the man who could have ended everything with a single telegram. Hauptmann Erich Vollmer arrived in Valmer-aux-Bois in the spring of 1943. He wasn't sent to hunt Jews. He wasn't part of the Gestapo. He was just a Wehrmacht officer assigned to oversee a quiet supply village that Berlin had forgotten about. But Vollmer had a problem. He noticed things. He noticed that every morning, like clockwork, the same children walked past his office window. Pairs of them. Always pairs. Always the same time. Always carrying the same battered school books. So he started counting. First week, 127 children. Second week, 127 children. Third month, 127 children. Sixth month, still 127 children. No new arrivals, no departures, no aging out. In a village of war orphans, supposedly waiting for family reunification, not a single child ever left. The numbers were frozen, impossible, wrong. Vollmer pulled the registrar's ledgers. Every name matched, every birth certificate verified, every ration card accounted for. But the numbers still didn't move. He knew what he was looking at. He just couldn't prove it without destroying 800 lives. If you despise men like Vollmer, men who held the fate of children in their hands and had to choose between career advancement and mass murder, then subscribe to this channel. Because what Vollmer does next will either make him a monster or something far more complicated. Hit that like button if you want to see how a Nazi officer with a ledger and a typewriter became the single greatest threat to Valmer's secret. This counting game is about to become a deadly chess match, and the children are the pieces on the board. Now let's get back into the story. To understand why Valmer succeeded, you have to understand what the village was before the children arrived. You have to go back to the wars that shaped it, the losses that hardened it, and the moment a quiet priest looked at a frightened 9-year-old girl and decided that obedience was no longer a virtue worth keeping. Valmer au Bois had buried too many sons. The Great War took 63 men from a village of barely 3,000. Their names were carved into the stone monument in the square. Names that belonged to brothers, fathers, husbands who left for the trenches in 1914 and never came home. The women who remained learned to run farms alone. The children grew up fatherless. And when the Second War came in 1940, when the German trucks rolled through and the swastika went up over the mayor's office, Valmer didn't resist. It survived. By 1942, survival meant ration cards and curfews and keeping your head down. It meant watching your words at the bakery and nodding when soldiers passed. The village had learned that defiance was expensive and silence was cheap, until Abbé Lucien Vaubert decided otherwise. Vaubert had been the village priest for 11 years, tall and lean, with wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light, and a black cassock he wore even in summer heat. He wasn't a man who commanded attention through volume. He commanded it through stillness. When he spoke from the pulpit, people leaned forward to hear him. When he walked the village roads with his wide-brimmed hat and silver cross, children stopped running to watch him pass. He believed in something the occupation had tried to stamp out, that routine could be sacred. That doing the right thing, every day, in the exact and same way, built a kind of moral armor that violence couldn't penetrate. And he believed the church doors should never be locked. The first child arrived on a Tuesday in November 1942. She was 9 years old, wearing a coat 3 sizes too large, with a paper tag pinned to the collar that read only a first name, Esther. No last name, no parents, no explanation. She stood at the rectory door in the pre-dawn darkness, shivering, silent, her eyes too old for her face. Vaubert took her in without asking questions. 3 days later, 2 more children appeared, then 5, then a dozen. They came on foot, smuggled in wagons, passed along by networks Vaubert didn't control and couldn't track. They arrived carrying nothing but fear and paper tags, and every single one of them had the same look, the look of someone who had already learned that adults couldn't be trusted to keep promises. The village noticed, and that's when the real decision was made. It happened in kitchens and workshops, in whispered conversations after Mass and across farmyard fences. Not a vote, not a meeting. Just a slow, collective realization spreading through Valmer like frost in creeping across a window. The question wasn't whether to help. It was how visibly they could afford to lie. That's when Sibylle Cournot became the most dangerous woman in occupied France. She was the village registrar, a position that sounded bureaucratic and boring until you understood what it meant. Sibylle controlled the ledgers, birth certificates, death records, census counts, every name, every number, every record the Germans used to track population had to pass through her office in the cramped stone building beside the church. And Sibylle had a gift. She never forgot a date. She could recite birth records from 1920 without opening a file. She knew which children had died of scarlet fever in 1938, which families had lost infants to winter cold, which names existed on paper but no longer existed in the world. Her mind was a graveyard of data, and she realized she could resurrect the dead. The plan Vaubert proposed was so audacious that when he first explained it to the village council, 3 men laughed. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. "We walk them," Vaubert said quietly, standing at the front of the church hall with his hands folded. "Every morning, same time, same route, in pairs." Silence. "You want to parade Jewish children past German checkpoints?" the baker finally asked. "I want to make them ordinary," Vaubert replied, "invisible through repetition." And so they built the architecture of walking. Every child was paired with another, always the same partner, always walking the same route at the same time each day. Older children carried younger ones' hands. They wore the same oversized coats, carried the same battered schoolbooks and dented lunch pails. They walked at the same pace, took the same turns, passed the same checkpoints at 7:47 a.m. every single morning. The Germans saw them constantly. That was the point. Familiarity doesn't breed suspicion. It breeds blindness. The human brain is designed to stop noticing patterns that repeat without variation. The soldiers who stood at the checkpoint each morning, watching children file past in pairs, day after day, week after week, stopped seeing them. They became part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the church bells at noon or the supply trucks at dawn. The children walked to a schoolhouse where teachers marked attendance but taught nothing. They sat at desks until mid-afternoon, then walked home in the same pairs, carrying the same books they'd carried that morning. Some were listed as apprentices in workshops that never opened. Others had work placements with farmers who never employed them. On paper, every child had a reason to be visible. In reality, every child was in hiding. But the system wasn't perfect. 3 weeks in, a boy of 7 stumbled on the cobblestones near the main checkpoint. His lunch pail clattered open, spilling nothing, because there was nothing inside. A German corporal standing guard took 2 steps forward, frowning. Vaubert, walking 15 feet behind the children as he always did not move. The boy's partner, a girl barely older, helped him up without speaking. They collected the pail, kept walking. The corporal watched them for another 5 seconds, then turned back to his post. Vaubert's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. But he didn't intervene. Couldn't. Because intervention would mean the children mattered, and children who mattered got questioned. The walk had to be boring, unremarkable, beneath notice. Another morning a soldier called out in German, "Halt!" and the entire line of children froze. Vaubert's blood went cold, but the soldier wasn't looking at the children. He was waving through a supply truck behind them. The children started walking again, and that's when Vaubert understood what they'd really built. The village wasn't hiding 800 children. It was training an occupying army to ignore them. Every morning, the Germans were being conditioned, taught through repetition that these children were part of the routine, part of the machinery of occupation, too ordinary to warrant a second glance. The soldiers were learning, day by day, that curiosity about the walking children led nowhere, so curiosity faded into indifference. The most dangerous resistance in Valmer wasn't secrecy, it was boredom. While Vaubert trained soldiers to ignore children through routine, Sibylle Cournot was waging a quieter war, one fought with ink, dates, and a memory that never failed her. Her weapon was the registrar's ledger. The thick leather-bound books that sat in neat rows in her cramped office weren't just records. They were the official reality of Valmer-au-Bois. Birth certificates, death records, census counts. Every person who existed in the eyes of the Reich had to exist first in Sibylle's ledgers. And Sibylle realized she could weaponize the dead. Her method was elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. She resurrected children who had died years earlier and gave their identities to the living. A boy who had died of scarlet fever in 1937 became a Jewish orphan, arriving in 1942. A girl who drowned in 1939 was reborn on forged baptism certificates. Sibyl matched birth dates within weeks, aligned family surnames with existing parish records, and made sure every invented backstory was technically verifiable. When Jewish children arrived with their paper tags and terrified eyes, Sibyl gave them French names, French birthplaces, and French deaths they were borrowing from ghosts. The census numbers never changed. That was crucial. Valmaire's population in 1942, after 800 Jewish children had arrived, still 2,847. The ledgers balanced perfectly because Sibyl understood something the Germans didn't. They weren't looking for discrepancies. They were looking for errors. And her books contained no errors. Every name had a birth certificate. Every birth certificate matched a baptism record. Every child walking the streets had paperwork that traced back years. Everything was technically correct. When the first German inspection came in January 1943, a bored Wehrmacht clerk spent 3 hours in Sibyl's office cross-referencing names. He checked death records against current ration cards. He verified ages against school enrollment lists. He counted children on paper and compared the number to the village census. It all matched. Sibyl sat across from him, hands folded, expression neutral, while her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that if he asked one question she couldn't answer, if he requested a family history she hadn't memorized, or a birth record she'd misaligned by even 2 weeks, 800 children would be arrested by nightfall. He closed the ledger, signed the inspection form, left. Sibyl didn't exhale until she heard his truck drive away. But the brilliance of her system came with a cost she hadn't anticipated. She was memorizing lives that had never existed, backstories for children who were living under stolen names. She knew which orphan was actually from Paris, which nephew had parents who'd been deported to Drancy, which cousin spoke no French and had to stay silent in public. She carried 800 lies in her head, and if she forgot even one, people died. At night, alone in her small apartment above the registrar's office, she recited names and dates like prayers, testing herself, making sure the architecture of her deception remained intact. And then in March 1943, something shifted. A new officer arrived at the registrar's office, not Wehrmacht, not SS. Just a mid-level administrator named Hauptmann Erich Vollmer, who'd been assigned to oversee supply logistics. He asked a question no one had asked before. "Why," he said, flipping through the ledgers, "do your orphan numbers never change?" Sibyl's blood went cold. Hauptmann Erich Vollmer wasn't supposed to be a problem. He arrived in Valmer-aux-Bois in March 1943 with orders to streamline supply logistics, a desk job for an officer who'd been wounded at Stalingrad and sent west to recover. He wasn't Gestapo. He wasn't a true believer. He was just a Wehrmacht bureaucrat with a limp and a typewriter, assigned to a backwater village that Berlin had mostly forgotten. But Vollmer had a fatal flaw. He noticed things. He noticed that every morning, like clockwork, children walked past his office window in pairs, always the same routes. He noticed they carried school books but never seemed to have homework. He noticed the schoolhouse was full of students but strangely quiet. No shouting, no playground chaos, just orderly lines filing in and out. Too many children. too orderly, too perfect. Something was wrong, and Vollmer couldn't stop himself from looking closer. He started counting. First casually, then obsessively. He pulled census records and cross-referenced them with ration distributions. He visited Sibylla's office and studied the ledgers until he could recite the numbers from memory. 127 orphans, every month, for 2 years straight. No departures, no aging out, frozen. And that's when Vollmer realized he was staring at the most audacious lie he'd ever encountered. But here was his dilemma. He couldn't prove it without catastrophe. To expose what Valmer was hiding, he'd need to round up every child, demand papers, conduct interrogations. He'd have to deploy SS units, lock down the village, and turn a quiet supply route into a war zone. And if he was wrong, if the ledgers were accurate, and he'd just arrested 800 French Catholic orphans, Berlin would crucify him for the embarrassment. The Reich wanted efficiency, not scandal. And Vollmer's career depended on things running smoothly. So he began a cat-and-mouse game he wasn't sure he wanted to win. Unannounced inspections, surprise audits. He'd arrive at the schoolhouse at random hours, watching for children who flinched when he spoke German, or who looked too nervous around uniforms. He'd stand at the checkpoint in the morning, studying faces, searching for the telltale signs of Jewish features the propaganda posters warned about. But the children never broke. They walked with the same blank, bored expressions every day. They didn't run. They didn't whisper. They just walked. And slowly, Vollmer began to understand 2 things. First, the village was lying. Every single person. The priest, the registrar, the farmers, the teachers, all of them were complicit in hiding hundreds of Jewish children in plain sight. Second, exposing the truth meant signing 800 death warrants. Vollmer wasn't a monster. He'd seen enough death at Stalingrad to last a lifetime. But he was a German officer, and duty had a weight he couldn't ignore. For weeks, he wrestled with the choice. Then, on April 17th, 1943, he made his decision. That morning, 2 military police vehicles arrived at the church. Soldiers pounded on the rectory door, and when Abbé Lucien Vaubert answered, still in his black cassock, wire-rimmed glasses catching the early light, they arrested him without explanation. The children watched from doorways and windows as their priest was loaded into a truck and driven away. And for the first time in months, the morning walk almost didn't happen. The morning after Vaubert's arrest, the children gathered in the pre-dawn darkness as they always did. No one told them to, no adult organized them. They simply appeared at their designated meeting points, pairs forming on street corners, in doorways, outside farmhouses, like a machine that had learned to run without its operator. The village held its breath. Without Vaubert walking behind them, without his quiet presence lending authority to the routine, would the children still be invisible? Would the soldiers at the checkpoint finally ask the questions they'd been trained not to ask? At 7:43 a.m., the first pair of children started walking. Then the second, then the third. By 7:45, all 127 children were moving through the streets in their usual formation, carrying their usual books, following their usual routes, silent, steady, unremarkable. And then Father Mathieu emerged from the church. He was the assistant priest, younger than Vaubert, less imposing, with nervous hands and a stammer he'd never fully outgrown. He wore his cassock and gripped his breviary like a shield as he fell into step 15 feet behind the children, exactly where Vaubert had always walked. The checkpoint came into view. 2 soldiers stood guard, the same ones who'd been there every morning for 6 months. They watched the children approach with the same bored expressions they always had. But then one of them frowned, scanning the line, clearly noticing that something was different. The priest was wrong. For 3 long seconds, the soldier's hand drifted toward his rifle. Father Mathieu's legs nearly gave out, but he kept walking, didn't slow, didn't look at the soldiers. Just maintained the same steady pace Vaubert had perfected, as if nothing in the world had changed. The children passed through the checkpoint. The soldier's hand fell away from his rifle. They let them pass. That's when the village understood something that terrified and amazed them in equal measure. The system no longer depended on Vaubert's authority. It no longer depended on faith or courage or the moral weight of a respected priest. It depended on repetition. The soldiers had been conditioned so thoroughly that the pattern itself had become invisible. The priest leading the children was just part of the routine, a detail that registered but didn't require thought. Change the priest, and the brain simply adjusted the pattern without questioning why. Vaubert had built something that could survive without him. He returned 4 days later. No explanation, no charges filed. The military police simply released him at the village edge and drove away. Vaubert walked back to the rectory, put on his cassock, and the next morning at 7:45 he resumed his place 15 feet behind the children. Nothing changed. The walks continued. The ledgers remained balanced. The checkpoint guards waved them through with the same indifference they'd shown for months. But something had shifted, just not in Valmer. In Berlin, in some office Vollmer would never identify, someone had noticed the village with frozen orphan numbers, and the priest who'd been arrested but not charged. Questions were being asked. Reports were being filed. And then, 3 weeks later, a rumor began circulating through the village. An anonymous letter had been written, sent to the regional SS headquarters, detailing the exact number of Jewish children hidden in Valmer-aux-Bois and the conspiracy that protected them. Someone had betrayed them, and the SS was coming. The SS order arrived on a Tuesday in June 1943. All residents were to remain indoors for a complete population verification. No exceptions, no movement until the count was finished. The children were explicitly forbidden to walk. The village elders met in the church sacristy that night, voices low, faces grim. For 3 years, they'd survived through invisibility and routine. Now the SS was forcing a confrontation, demanding the village break its pattern or openly defy a direct order. Vaubert listened to the debate for 20 minutes. Then he stood. "We walk," he said quietly. "All of them. Tomorrow morning. Same time." "That's suicide," the baker whispered. "No," Vaubert replied. "Hiding is suicide. We've taught them to ignore the children. Now we prove they can't count them." At 7:45 a.m. the next morning, every single one of the 800 children walked, not in pairs, not in scattered groups spread across different routes, all together. A river of children flooding the main street, filling the square, walking past the checkpoint where a stunned SS Hauptsturmführer stood with a clipboard and a growing expression of fury. "Halt!" he screamed. "I ordered everyone indoors!" The children kept walking, silent, steady, eyes forward. "I will have you all arrested," the officer shouted. But his voice was lost in the sound of 800 pairs of feet on cobblestone. He tried to count them, started at the front, pointing at each child, muttering numbers. But they wouldn't stop moving, wouldn't line up, just kept flowing past him in an endless stream that broke his concentration. 73, no, wait. He lost his place, started over. 41, 42, damn it! Sibylle Cournot appeared at his elbow, ledger in hand. 127, sir, she said calmly. As always. Would you like to verify against the registry? The officer stared at her, then at the children still walking past, then back at his clipboard where his own count read something between 90 and 200. He couldn't prove her wrong without admitting he couldn't count his own prisoners. But the SS didn't give up that easily. 2 days later, the trucks arrived. 12 vehicles. Dogs straining at leashes. Soldiers fanning out through the village with lists compiled from the informant's letter. They kicked down doors, searched attics, dragged families into the square for interrogation. The children walked anyway, right through the chaos, right past the soldiers tearing apart houses. At 7:45 a.m., like clockwork, 800 children moved through the village in their usual pairs, while German shepherds barked and officers screamed orders. The searches found nothing. The interrogations produced no confessions. The dogs followed scent trails that led to schoolhouses and churches, places the children were already known to be. That night, the informant, a shopkeeper named Bertrand, who'd collaborated for extra rations, fled the village under cover of darkness. He made it 3 kilometers before someone, no one ever discovered who, stopped him on the road. His body was found the next morning. The SS left 2 days later, furious and empty-handed, and the children kept walking. The village stood unbroken. June 1944 brought chaos to occupied France. The Allied invasion at Normandy shattered the illusion of German invincibility. Wehrmacht units were being pulled from quiet villages and rushed to the front. Supply lines collapsed. Communications broke down. And in the confusion, Berlin began issuing final orders, liquidation commands for anyone who might become a liability during the retreat. On June 18th, Hauptmann Erich Vollmer received a telegram marked Geheime Reichssache, Secret Reich Matter. It contained a single directive. All Jewish persons in his administrative district were to be rounded up and deported to Drancy within 72 hours. A transport train was being arranged. SS units would arrive to assist, no exceptions. The telegram included specific intelligence from the informant's letter. 800 children hidden in Valmer-au-Bois. Vollmer read it 3 times in his office, hands shaking. Then he walked to the fireplace and burned it. He didn't file a report, didn't request clarification, didn't pass the order down the chain of command. He simply destroyed the only physical evidence that the order had ever existed and walked out into the summer evening. 20 minutes later, he knocked on the rectory door. Vaubert answered, still in his cassock, and for a long moment the 2 men simply stared at each other. The priest who had lied for 3 years, and the officer who had known the truth for months. "Tomorrow ends the walking," Vollmer said quietly, in careful French. Vaubert's face remained expressionless. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." Vollmer glanced over his shoulder, checking the empty street. "An SS detachment is coming, not for inspections, for deportations. They'll arrive in 2 days, maybe 3. The chaos is buying you time, but not much." "Why are you telling me this?" Vollmer was silent for a moment. "Because I've been counting for a year," he finally said, "and I'm tired of it. Get them out of here, Father, before someone who isn't tired arrives." He turned and limped back toward his office, leaving Vaubert standing in the doorway. The village prepared in silence. No meetings, No announcements. Just whispered conversations in kitchens and quiet instructions passed between neighbors. Maps were studied. Border routes were memorized. Families who'd agreed to take children on the final journey made ready. The children were told just enough. Not the full truth, that the SS was coming to kill them. Not the complete plan. Too many details could lead to panic. Just what they needed to know. The walking was going to change. They would leave in pairs as always, but this time they wouldn't come back. Some of the younger ones cried. The older ones, who'd learned to read the silences between adults, simply nodded. At dawn on June 20th, the last walk began. The first day looked like every other morning for 3 years. At 7:45 a.m. the children left in pairs. Same routes, same pace, same bored expressions. The checkpoint guards waved them through without looking up. Volmer watched from his office window and said nothing. But the children didn't come back. The pairs reached the edge of the village, past the last checkpoint. And then, where the forest road curved out of sight, they fractured. Guides appeared from the trees, locals who knew every smuggling route from the wars before this one. The children were split into smaller groups, given new directions, and sent deeper into the woods on paths the Germans had never bothered to map. Some headed for the Swiss border, 40 kilometers south. Others went west toward Allied lines that were pushing inland from Normandy. A few were taken to monasteries and convents that had agreed to hide them until liberation came. The walking had taught them everything they needed: how to move without panic, how to stay silent under pressure, how to trust the person next to you, even when the world made no sense. The second day, more children walked out and didn't return. By the third morning, Valmer-aux-Bois was empty of orphans. The square stood silent at 7:45 a.m. for the first time in 3 years. No pairs forming, no footsteps on cobblestone, no children carrying books to schools that taught nothing. The checkpoint guards noticed immediately. They radioed their superior. Volmer wrote in his logbook, "Population normalized, orphan relocation complete." At 9:30 a.m. the SS trucks arrived. 3 vehicles filled with officers carrying the informant's letter and deportation orders. They stormed into the village expecting to find 800 Jews and found empty streets instead. They interrogated Sibylle. She showed them ledgers indicating the orphans had been transferred to a facility near Lyon. Paperwork she'd forged the night before with dates that predated the SS order by 2 weeks. They questioned Vaubert. He confirmed the transfer with the calm, unbothered tone of a man describing parish finances. They searched every building, every barn, every cellar. Nothing. The children were already across borders the SS couldn't reach, walking toward freedom in the same pairs that had kept them alive for 3 years. The SS left empty-handed. Again. Liberation came 3 months later. American tanks rolled through Valmer-aux-Bois in September 1944, and the swastikas came down. The checkpoints disappeared. The occupation ended. But the children who'd been saved were still orphans. Most had no families left to return to, no homes that still stood, no parents who'd survived the camps. So the village made another decision. The same families who'd given them false names and hidden identities now gave them real homes. Farmers adopted children they'd employed on paper. Teachers took in students they'd never actually taught. Sibylle, who'd memorized 800 lies, became guardian to 3 children whose real names she'd learned only after liberation. Valmer-aux-Bois had saved them, and now it kept them. 70 years later, on a cold morning in November, a small group of elderly men and women returned to Valmer-aux-Bois. They walked the same cobblestone streets they'd walked as children. past the checkpoint that no longer existed, past the schoolhouse where they'd sat in silence, past the church where Vaubert, long since buried, had taught them that resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. They walked in pairs. Still, because some routines once learned become part of who you are, and because walking, they had discovered, was how you survived when the world demanded you disappear. The most powerful resistance is not always rebellion. Sometimes it is consistency. Sometimes it is refusing to change your behavior even when power demands fear. Valmer-au-Bois teaches us that tyranny depends on disruption, panic, secrecy, reaction. The Nazis built their entire system on making people afraid to be visible, forcing them into hiding where they could be hunted one by one. The village survived because it did the opposite. It normalized courage until violence had nowhere to land. It turned heroism into routine, resistance into boredom, and visibility into the ultimate disguise. 800 children walked past armed soldiers for 3 years, not because the soldiers were incompetent, but because the human brain stops questioning patterns that repeat without variation. Vaubert understood something profound. Evil expects you to run. It expects you to hide, to panic, to change your behavior in ways that make you easier to detect. It never expects you to keep walking. That's the lesson of Valmer-au-Bois. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to act like you're afraid. That power, for all its violence and surveillance, can be defeated by people who simply refuse to change, who do the right thing every single day in exactly the same way, until the system built to destroy them can no longer see them. The children of Valmer survived because an entire village decided that consistency was more dangerous than secrecy, and 800 lives were saved by people who just kept walking. If this story changed how you think about courage, hit that subscribe button. We dig up the resistance stories history buried, the villages, the conspirators, the quiet heroes who saved lives without firing a shot. That video on your screen right now? Another impossible survival story. Another group of people who refused to accept what evil told them was inevitable. Click it, because the best resistance to forgetting is remembering.